Hi Year 12, good morning, it's Mrs. Reed here and welcome to the second lesson that we are looking at our news case study. Today is quite a wide-ranging lesson. It looks at understanding a bit more about the news industry, particularly in the UK. It looks at the evolution of news and how technological change plays an important part in the way in which we consume news media. I'd like to start though with a bit of retrieval first. And as you know, when we come across any new case study in media, it's going to be very terminology heavy. We're going to come across a whole new range of terms linked to that particular platform and genre of text. So we're starting out with a retrieval quiz which asks which term. So I'm going to give you a definition and I want you to try and tell me, if you know it, the term that links to that definition. So number 1, which term refers to those in positions of power who aim to persuade an audience of their point of view? So we've talked about this. We might talk about this in relation to the front page of a newspaper, for example, or even the front page of a magazine or potentially an advert. Number 2, which term refers to the criteria that influences the stories which are selected for the news agenda each day? So there was a list there of around 12 things that we use to determine the newsworthiness of a story. Number 3, which term is used to refer to journalism which is collected by members of the general public? So people who may be there and be an eyewitness to an event and be, there firsthand when a story unfolds. And finally, which term refers to a person or an organisation that might be involved in filtering content in some way? So the process which determines what we do and don't see in the news agenda. Pause the video and make sure you've had a go at writing down a term for questions 1 to 4. Okay, so let's go through the answers. You may wish to use a different colour pen here to mark. So number 1, this term was opinion leaders. Okay, we can see the front page of a newspaper, for example, as being an opinion leader. It shows a particular perspective and a version of an event that might be designed to persuade our opinion, the audience's opinion. Number 2, that set of criteria was called our news values. Number 3, journalism collected by the general public was known as citizen journalism. And finally, that process of determining and filtering the content that we see in the news was known as gatekeeping. So all of those were terms that should have been covered in our last lesson. And we know that repeated application and exposure to new terminology helps to build it into our long-term memory. Okay, so the starting point for today's lesson is actually a piece of reading. I want you to read through the document I've shared with you on Show My Homework, and I've titled this a really short history of news. It is just that, it is a very brief history, but I do think when we're looking at a new form of media, actually having a bit of a timeline and an understanding of how a form of media has been established and has evolved over the years is a really important foundation for building on the rest of our case study. So this document will talk you through the early stages of print media, right the way through to what challenges the news industry may have faced into the modern day. I've created for you 6 questions to check your understanding and comprehension of the text. So at this point, please pause the video, make sure you've done your reading and you've completed questions 1 to 6. Okay, so as you can see, the news media as we know it today hasn't just appeared out of nowhere. It's not, suddenly such a big part of our lives accidentally. It has been around and established for a very, very long time. So the evolution of news, when we're trying to understand it, really starts with understanding print media. And you study a lot of print media through this course, whether you're looking at advertising, film posters, magazine covers, newspapers. So we know that this kind of news media has actually been established since the 1600s. And it really increases in its circulation and its ability to reach a wide range of people after the establishment of the printing press, and also after the lapse of the Licensing Act, which means that people are free to print newspapers on a much broader scale. And we saw that date of kind of 1900 as being really significant in the sheer number of newspapers which were being able to be printed and circulated to an audience on a daily basis. One of the first challenges to printed news then comes in the 1920s with the establishing of radio and the ability to listen to news in your home on another device, to have that voice talking you through the news events. And that is still an important form of news today. So those traditional forms of media such as print and radio haven't gone away. They're still a big industry in themselves. But they are constantly evolving into new forms too. So it's from around the mid-1950s that people start to have televisions in the home. So television obviously poses a bigger challenge to print and radio. We know that television news is a huge industry in its own right, and it really evolves from being news at a certain time of day. So we might have had the 6 o'clock news or the 9 o'clock news, now probably the 10 o'clock news more likely. Those particular times of day where an audience would sit down in front of a television and get a briefing and a roundup of the biggest news stories of that day. We know this has really evolved over time then, really to the 1980s. And it's in 1980 with the establishment of CNN as the first 24-hour news channel. And this begins to change news again. It's not simply a newspaper that you pick up in the morning and read through the events. It's not a short briefing on the radio or a daily roundup of news on the television. But suddenly we have not just the reporting of news and facts, but the desire for news content. And there's a difference there. Because when we're talking about news content, it's not always just about establishing the facts. News content often contains a lot of opinion pieces, speculation, interviews with people affected by the story, and the bringing in of experts. So this begins to, again, change the shape of news and what people expect to see. And finally, as you know from your reading, the 1990s and onwards, particularly from the point of Web 2.0, we see the rise of online and digital news. And this is a rapidly evolving and changing news landscape where we can access news content on websites, on social media, on apps on our phone, and again it feeds into this 24-hour news cycle that is very different from the daily reporting of content that we might have seen in the past, to being this continuous evolving kind of breaking news cycle where we are being kept up to date with significant stories that are relevant to our lives in the UK, but also global stories and events, as well as more trivial pieces that are around celebrity, entertainment and gossip. One of the biggest factors then, when we're looking at how the news industry has changed over time, has to be that consideration of technological convergence. The way in which technology has evolved to merge and become integrated, as I've discussed with you in the past, is best demonstrated through our mobile phones. Those traditional forms of media, print and radio, television, for example, all still exist. But those constantly evolving forms of digital media become merged with our traditional forms in one place and one device. And we can watch television news through the BBC, we can listen to podcasts on the radio, we can read today's newspapers and front pages on our phones, as well as access, as I've mentioned, those websites, apps, social media, and also share news with one another. Now, I thought to break this lesson up, rather than just you listening to me talk for a while, it might be interesting just to have a look at the changing media landscape with a focus on an advert. Now, this is an award-winning advert. It's actually quite old now. It was 2012, I think it came out. And it is produced to promote the values, really, and the ideas of open journalism in The Guardian. But I think it's a really interesting one, just to look at the nature of modern news and what it seems to suggest about the way that the news industry has changed and the way in which we as an audience might respond to the news that we see. So I would encourage you to stop here and to go to Share My Homework, follow that link, and have a look at the Three Little Pigs advert. Make some notes on what you see is happening here and have a go at answering the 2 questions. Okay, so hopefully from the advert you can see this idea of the nature of modern news being designed to give us different angles, different perspectives and opinions on a range of events. I think it really positions the audience to view news as something dramatic and exciting, where we are being given an insight into every angle on a news story, whether it's from the police perspective, we're seeing it from the people who are involved in it, so their own feelings and opinions. And we might see the way in which the audience is responsive via social media, how that might also shape the narrative that we see in the news, how audiences might be inspired by those news events to take action, whether it's a protest, for example, how some people might engage with the news for entertainment purposes and humour, for example. There's a whole array of different perspectives on news, I think, that's conveyed through that really excellent advert. But it's supposed to present the ideas of open journalism, that there is not just one set of facts, that there are different ways of looking at the story, and that the role of the journalist is to actually start to unpick what's going on and get to, the heart of the news story rather than just the initial reporting of it. So news is something continually evolving and a story unfolding and developing over time. Okay, so that brings us to our case study. Now, I mentioned last lesson that, of course, our case study is about every area of the theoretical framework. So we study the news industry as well as the news, language of news, representations and audiences. We do have 2 case study texts to look at. So this means that we're particularly interested in the UK newspaper industry, and we'll be looking at the Daily Mail as a tabloid newspaper alongside the Times, which is more of a traditional broadsheet. We'll be looking at the ownership of those newspapers, their political leanings and bias, and the types of news stories that they run and who reads them. We're not really going to focus on those 2 specifically today, but instead we're going to think about the background to the news industry in the UK. So one of the things we need to do in terms of building our industry knowledge is, just like with the film industry, think about ownership. Now, you've done a lot of work in looking at the film industry, and that has provided you already with a lot of key terms and knowledge from which we can build on the newspaper industry. So there is not a lot of links really between some of the case studies. So when we think about ownership, we get back to thinking about ideas of the concentration of ownership and even ideas of conglomerates and monopoly. So newspaper titles, like the Times and the Daily Mirror, are owned like any other product that is made to be sold. So the British press we can see as a business. It's designed as a commercial industry to make money. So when we talk about ownership, we're interested in who financially supports and produces the newspaper. So of course there are different ownership models in news. We're going to talk about 3 of them through this industry. So we'll be interested in the ownership models of media barons. So I mentioned last lesson a reference to Rupert Murdoch. So we're interested in who are the wealthy individuals, we call them proprietors, who own a newspaper and its related media content. An alternative model then is a trust. So a trust is a legal arrangement whereby finances from the owner are transferred to a trustee to manage and control the newspaper. An example of a trust might be something like The Guardian newspaper. And a conglomerate, as we know, refers to those huge global institutions that own numerous media subsidiaries. And these conglomerates might work alongside each other to profit the owners, and they might also be owned by some of our media barons. So we can see some of the links here to what we were discussing in terms of the film industry. There are some issues then with ownership of news. Of course, I talked to you before about the news not being just a window onto the world, it being a construction of and a version of reality and the events that we see as newsworthy. So ownership plays a part in this. In fact, the ownership of news in the UK has become highly concentrated. The UK print news industry is run by just 7 companies, 60% of which, of the market share of which, is owned by 2 conglomerates, News UK and DMG Media. They are highly profitable industries, so the newspaper industry contributes highly to the UK economy. And just to give you a little example, The Sun, The Times and The Sunday Times, which is News UK, have a weekly circulation, so that's the number of copies of the newspaper that are being circulated to an audience, of around 12 million a week. And the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday, owned by DMG Media, have over 8 million weekly circulation. So there's a huge amount of profit to be made from print media alone, the print news industry, but we'll look at how that changes when we look at news online too. So just like any commercial industry, we have economic models and funding models to be aware of. Newspapers make their money really through the circulation, so the number of copies of a newspaper being sold, as well as through advertising. And just to give you an idea, a full-page colour advert in something like the Daily Mail costs around £30,000. So money might also come from the owner of that newspaper publication. So those media barons have a lot of money to invest, and they may come from being part of a conglomerate. So they may be able to invest money from one of the subsidiaries, for example. But also subscription and donation play a big part in the new newspaper industry. So you may see now quite a few newspapers promoting a subscription model where you can sign up to have access to their online content alongside a daily newspaper delivered to you. There might be some also that use a paywall In fact, I think the Times is one of those. For that online content, they will use a paywall, so you need to be able to have signed up to a subscription to access all of the content. Others will ask for reader donations. The Guardian, you see this quite often pop up, asking for people to donate to keeping all of their news stories free online, and it's the alternative really to needing a paywall in place. One of the things that we need to be aware of, though, when looking at the newspaper industry is that print media is an industry in decline. The British news industry has been facing a crisis where we're seeing a decline in the number of copies that are in demand really from readers in print circulation. So this causes economic pressures due to falling sales and a loss of income, and it really means that those newspapers have to adapt. They have to be able to change in line with audience consumption habits and, of course, technological change. To give you just an idea of what that means for the UK newspaper industry, well, if we take something like The Guardian, it's been widely reported that they've lost around 20,000 print readers over the last decade. We have some UK newspapers which have gotten rid of their daily printed paper altogether. The Independent, for example, is now only an online newspaper. And what we're also seeing is that established news owners may be looking to sell their newspaper titles for profit because of that decline in sales. In fact, in November 2019, the Daily Mail bought the Eye newspaper, so that becomes part of the DMG Media conglomerate. And I've linked you to the article there if you want to read a little bit more about that. So technological change, as I've mentioned, plays a big part in the way that the news industry works. The proliferation of digital technology is one of the largest sources of news today. So the UK newspaper industry does face competition from some big institutions online. BBC News is one of those institutions, as are Facebook and Google, as we may have predicted before when we looked at, those who makes the most money, who has the most power online. So Facebook and Google are going to be quite interesting to explore when we look at the nature of online news. Now, in order to remain relevant in the digital age, the owners of newspapers we know have expanded their titles online, and this can serve really a number of purposes. In terms of production, online news reduces the environmental cost. They're not having to use the printing press, they're not having to use paper to print it on, people to deliver it. So there's a lot of reduction of cost in terms of the environment and in the distribution as well. We don't physically need people to go and deliver those newspapers each day. It also means that the newspaper can be distributed more widely to a global audience if it's online. And overall, it can actually have a positive impact on circulation figures. So it can increase the overall circulation, and it gives them, importantly, data that they can analyse and monitor to see which stories have been most popular. So, for an example here, if somebody just picks up a copy of the Daily Mirror and is reading that content, it doesn't really give any information to the owners as to which stories are most popular. But if somebody clicks on an article on the website, then automatically it's collecting that data. How many people have clicked on this? How long have they stayed looking at that story? How many times has it been retweeted or liked on social media? So online news provides so much more information and digital information and data that can be monitored in order to maintain your audiences and make sure you're putting out the content that is going to interest them the most. Okay, so I've got some facts here. I actually want to check these. It's been a little while. I think I was looking at this prior to Christmas with year 13. So we might want to look at whether this needs to be updated. So in terms of desktop, mobile, tablets, social media, just to give you an idea, the amount of people, or the readership as we would call it, who are accessing online news daily is extremely high. So it's thought then that there's around 4 million people accessing news content via a desktop every day, 27 million accessing news via a mobile phone, and 26 via social media each week. So there's a huge amount of, there might be crossover between some of those figures as well. So the readership and circulation of online news is particularly high. So that's also got to form part of our case study. What is the difference and the changes between print media and digital media? Okay, lots of information there, so it's time to bring this bit to an end. I know you would have been making your notes as you've gone through the lesson, so I want you to answer 2 questions. Number 1, can you write a short summary here, so this is a paragraph rather than bullet points, as to how technological change has affected newspapers? And also then an opinion. Why do you think it's important for newspapers to have an online presence, in the digital age? Once you've completed those, can you send me a copy of them so I can have a look? And I will then use that to inform my next lesson, to look at whether there's any areas that we need to recap and to build on your responses. So thank you for listening. I hope that's been interesting, informative, and I look forward to our next lesson where we'll start to look at the language of newspapers.